Sir George Grey, KCB, was a British soldier, explorer, Governor of South Australia, twice Governor of New Zealand, Governor of Cape Colony, the 11th Premier of New Zealand, and a writer. By political philosophy a Gladstonian liberal, Grey eschewed the class system for the prosaic life of Auckland's new governance he helped to establish. Early life and exploration. Grey was born in Lisbon, Portugal, the only son of BVT, Lieutenant Colonel George Grey, of the 30th Regiment of Foot, who was killed at the Battle of Badajoz in Spain just a few days before. His mother, Elizabeth Ann eschewed Vinyals, on the balcony of her hotel in Lisbon, overheard two officers speak of her husband's death, and this brought on the premature birth of the child. She was the daughter of a retired soldier-turned-Irish clergyman, Major later Rev. John Vinyals. Grey's grandfather was Owen Wynne Grey. Grey's uncle was John Grey, who was Owen Wynne Grey's son from his second marriage. Grey was sent to the Royal Grammar School, Guildford in Surrey, and was admitted to the Royal Military College in 1826. Early in 1830, he was gazetted ensign in the 83rd Regiment of Foot. In 1830, his regiment having been sent to Ireland, he developed much sympathy with the Irish peasantry, whose misery made a great impression on him. He was promoted lieutenant in 1833 and obtained a first-class certificate at the examinations of the Royal Military College, Sandhurst, in 1836. In 1837, at the age of 25, Grey led a catastrophically ill-prepared expedition of exploration of northwest Australia. Only one man of his party had seen northern Australia before. It was at the time believed that a great river entered the Indian Ocean from the northwest of Australia, and that the country it drained might be suitable for colonization. Grey, in conjunction with Lieutenant Franklin Lushington, of the 9th Regiment of Foot, offered to explore this country, and on the 5th of July 1837 he sailed from Plymouth in command of a party of 5, the others being Lushington, Dr. William Walker, a surgeon and naturalist, and Corporals Coles and Auger of the Royal Sappers and Miners. Others joined the party at Cape Town, and early in December they landed at Hanover Bay, wrecked, almost drowned, and completely lost, with Grey speared in the hip in a skirmish with Aborigines. They traced the course of the Glenelg River before giving up. They were picked up by the Beagle and liner and taken to Mauritius to recover. 2 years later, Grey returned to Western Australia and was again wrecked with his party, again including Surgeon Walker. At Kalbarri, they were the first Europeans to see the Gascoyne River, but then had to walk to Perth, surviving the journey through the efforts of Khyber, a Wajak Noongar who organized food and what water could be found. At about this time, Grey became one of the few Europeans to learn the Noongar language of southwest Western Australia. Upon the death of Sir Richard Spencer RNKCH, the government resident magistrate at King George Sound, Western Australia, in July 1839, Grey was promoted to captain and appointed temporary resident magistrate. Marriage and children. On the 2nd of November 1839 at King George Sound, Grey married Eliza Lucy Spencer, daughter of the late government resident. Their only child, born in 1841 in South Australia, died aged 5 months. It was not a happy marriage. Grey, obstinate in his domestic affairs as in his first expedition, accused his wife unjustly of flirting with Rear Admiral Sir Henry Keppel on the voyage to Cape Town taken in 1860. He sent her away. She lived a life of misery until old age brought a formal reunion, but coexisted unhappily until 1897. Grey adopted Annie Maria Matthews in 1861, following the death of her father, his half-brother, Sir Godfrey Thomas. She married Seymour Thorne George on 3 December 1872 on Kowau Island. Governor of South Australia. Grey was the third Governor of South Australia, from 1841 to 1845, as the British government was concerned about the treatment of Aborigines by settlers, and Grey was known to have sympathies with the indigenous people. He oversaw the colony during a difficult formative period, despite being seen as less hands-on than his predecessor, George Gawler. His fiscally responsible measures ensured the colony was in good shape by the time he left to govern New Zealand. Governor of New Zealand. Grey served as Governor of New Zealand twice, from 1845 to 1853, and from 1861 to 1868. He was arguably the most influential figure during the European settlement of New Zealand during much of the 19th century. During this time, European settlement accelerated, and in 1859 the number of Pākehā came to equal the number of Maori at around 60,000 each. Settlers were keen to obtain land and some Maori were willing to sell, but there were also strong pressures to retain land, in particular from the Maori King movement. Grey had to manage the demand for land for the settlers to farm and the commitments in the Treaty of Waitangi that the Maori chiefs retained full, exclusive and undisturbed possession of the lands and estates, forests, fisheries and other properties. The treaty also specifies that Maori will sell land only to the Crown. The potential for conflict between the Maori and settlers was exacerbated as the British authorities progressively eased restrictions on land sales. After an agreement at the end of 1840 between the company and Colonial Secretary Lord John Russell, which provided for land purchases by the New Zealand Company from the Crown at a discount price, and a charter to buy and sell land under government supervision, money raised by the government from sales to the company would be spent on assisting migration to New Zealand. The agreement was hailed by the company as all that we could desire. Our company is really to be the agent of the state for colonizing NZ. The government waived its right of preemption in the Wellington region, Whanganui and New Plymouth in September 1841. First term. Grey was appointed the third Governor of New Zealand in 1845. During the tenure of his predecessor, Robert Fitzroy, violence over land ownership broke out in the Wairau Valley in the South Island in June 1843. Then in March 1845 Honhake began the Flagstaff War, the causes of which can be attributed to the conflict between what the Ngāpuhi understood to be the meaning of the Treaty of Waitangi and the actions of succeeding governors of asserting authority over the Maori. Fighting in the Nelson area by Ngāti Toa, a land dispute that began before Grey's arrival in Zealand, was a dispute as to sale of land on the Wairau Plains to Captain Blenkinsop. He had negotiated with Ngāti Toa that he could take wood and water from Cloudy Bay in payment of a ship's cannon, but the document that Blenkinsop drew up in English, which the chiefs could not read, stated that 26,500 acres of the Wairau Plains were sold to Blenkinsop. A major clash came in 1843 when Te Rauteparaha and his nephew Te Rangi Hareata tried to prevent the survey of lands in the Wairau Plains. These lands had been claimed by the New Zealand Company on two grounds: alleged purchase by Captain Blenkinsop, master of a Sydney whaler in 1831-2, and the negotiations between the principal agent and Rauteparaha, the head of this tribe, in 1839. The Ngāti Toa war party warned off the surveyors, but they persisted. Te Rauteparaha burnt down a whaling hut which contained the surveyors' equipment. The local magistrate ordered his arrest and deputized about 50 settlers for this purpose. Te Rauteparaha resisted. Fighting broke out and 22 settlers and at least 4 Maori were killed. Te Rangi Hareata, the warlike nephew of Te Rauteparaha, insisted on killing the captured men because his wife, who was Te Rauteparaha's daughter and Captain Benkensop's ex-wife, had been accidentally shot and killed. The settlers were furious, as many of those killed in Utu were unarmed Quakers. Te Rauteparaha was astonished not to face a strong British military reaction. He left the Rangitane land he had conquered and never returned. These events took place during the governorship of Robert Fitzroy. It was not until 1846 that Governor Grey had Te Rauteparaha arrested. However, his imprisonment, which remained controversial amongst the Ngāti Toa, was not related to the Wairau fray, Hone Heke and the fighting in the Bay of Islands. In 1845, George Grey arrived in New Zealand to take up his appointment as governor. At this time, Hone Heke challenged the authority of the British, beginning by cutting down the flagstaff on Flagstaff Hill at Kororareka. On this flagstaff, the flag of the United Tribes of New Zealand had previously flown. Now the Union Jack was hoisted, hence the flagstaff symbolized the grievances of Heke and his ally Te Ruki Kauiti. As to changes that had followed the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, there were many causes of the Flagstaff War, and Heke had a number of grievances in relation to the Treaty of Waitangi. While land acquisition by the Church Missionary Society had been controversial, the rebellion led by Heke was directed against the colonial forces, with the CMS missionaries trying to persuade Heke to end the fighting. Despite the fact that Tamati Wakanene and most of Ngāpuhi sided with the government, the small and ineptly led British had been beaten at Battle of Orar were backed by financial support. Far more troops, armed with 32-pounder cannons, that had been denied to Fitzroy. Grey attacked and occupied Kauiti's fortress at Ruapekipeka. This forced Kauiti to retreat. The Ngāpuhi were astonished that the British could keep an army of nearly 1,000 soldiers in the field continuously. Heke's confidence waned after he was wounded in battle with Tamati Wakanene and his warriors, and by the realization that the British had far more resources than he could muster. His enemies included some Pakeha Maori supporting colonial forces. After the Battle of Ruapekipeka, Heke and Kauiti were ready for peace. It was Tamati Wakanene they approached to act as intermediary in negotiations with Governor Grey, who accepted the advice of Nene that Heke and Kauiti should not be punished for the rebellion. The fighting in the north ended and there was no punitive confiscation of Ngāpuhi land. The Ngāti Rangatahi and Hutt Valley campaign. Colonists arrived at Port Nicholson, Wellington in November 1839 in ships chartered by the New Zealand Company. Within months the New Zealand Company purported to purchase approximately 20 million acres in Nelson, Wellington, Wanganui and Taranaki. Disputes arose as to the validity of purchases of land, which disputes remained unresolved when Grey became governor. The company saw itself as a prospective quasi-government of New Zealand, and in 1845 and 1846 proposed splitting the colony in two, along a line from Okau in the west to Cape Kidnappers in the east, with the north reserved for Maori and missionaries. The south would become a self-governing province, known as New Victoria, and managed by the company for that purpose. Britain's colonial secretary rejected the proposal. The company was known for its vigorous attacks on those it perceived as its opponents: the British Colonial Office, successive governors of New Zealand, and the Church Missionary Society that was led by the Rev. Henry Williams. Williams attempted to interfere with the land purchasing practices of the company, which exacerbated the ill will that was directed at the CMS by the company in Wellington and the promoters of colonization in Auckland, who had access to the governor and to the newspapers that had started publication. Unresolved land disputes that had resulted from New Zealand Company operations erupted into fighting in the Hutt Valley in 1845 1846. The Ngāti Rangatahi were determined to retain possession of the land. They assembled a force of about 200 warriors led by Te Rangi Hareata, Te Rauteparaha's cousin, also the person who had killed unarmed captives in Wairau fray. Governor Gray moved troops into the area and by February had assembled nearly 1,000 men together with some Maori allies from the Te Atiaia Hapu to begin the Hutt Valley campaign. The Maori attacked Taita on 3 March 1846, but were repulsed by a company of the 96th Regiment. The same day Gray declared martial law in the Wellington area. Richard Taylor, a CMS missionary from Wanganui, attempted to persuade the Ngāti Tama and Ngāti Rangatahi to leave the disputed land. Eventually Gray paid compensation for the potato crop they had planted on the land. He also gave them 300 acres at Kaifara by the modern ferry terminal. Chief Taringakuri agreed to these terms, but when the settlers tried to move onto the land they were frightened off. On the 27th of February the British and the Te Atiaia allies burnt the Maori pa at Maraenuku in the Hutt Valley, which had been built on land that the settlers claimed to own. The Ngāti Rangatahi retaliated on 1 and 3 March by raiding settlers' farms, destroying furniture, smashing windows, killing pigs, and threatening the settlers with death if they gave the alarm. They murdered Andrew Gillespie and his son. 13 families of settlers moved into Wellington for safety. Governor Gray proclaimed martial law on 3 March. Sporadic fighting continued, including a major attack on a defended position at Bulcott's farm on 6 May. On 6 August 1846, one of the last engagements was fought at the Battle of Battle Hill, after which Te Rangi Hareata left the area. The Hutt Valley campaign was followed by the Wanganui campaign from April to July 1847. In January 1846, 15 chiefs of the area, including Te Rauteparaha, had sent a combined letter to the newly arrived Governor Gray, pledging their loyalty to the Crown. After intercepting letters from Te Rauteparaha, Gray realized he was playing a double game. He was receiving and sending secret instructions to the local Maori who were attacking settlers. In a surprise attack on his pa at Taupo at dawn on 23 July, Te Rauteparaha, who was now quite elderly, was captured and taken prisoner. The justification given for his arrest was weapons supplied to Maori deemed to be in open rebellion against the Crown. However, charges were never laid against Te Rauteparaha, so his detention was declared unlawful, while Gray's declaration of martial law was within his authority. Internment without trial would only be lawful if it had been authorized by statute. Te Rauteparaha was held prisoner on HMS Driver, then he was taken to Auckland on HMS Calliope where he remained imprisoned until January 1848. His son Tamihana was studying Christianity in Auckland and Te Rauteparaha gave him a solemn message that the iwi should not take utu against the government. Tamihana returned to his rota to stop a planned uprising. Tamihana sold the Wairau land to the government for £3,000. Gray spoke to Te Rauteparaha and persuaded him to give up all outstanding claims to land in the Wairau Valley. Then, realizing he was old and sick, he allowed Te Rauteparaha to return to his people at Otaki in 1848. Government at Auckland. Auckland was made the new capital in March 1841 and by the time Gray was appointed governor in 1845, it had become a commercial centre as well as including the administrative institutions such as the Supreme Court. After the conclusion of the war in the north, Government policy was to place a buffer zone of European settlement between the Ngāpuhi and the city of Auckland. The background to the invasion of Waikato in 1863 also, in part, reflected a belief that the Auckland was at risk from attack by the Waikato Maori. Governor Grey had to contend with newspapers that were unequivocal to the support of the interests of the settlers. The Auckland Times, Auckland Chronicle, the Southern Cross, which started by William Brown as a weekly paper in 1843, and the New Zealander, which was started in 1845 by John Williamson. These newspapers were known for their partisan editorial policies. Both William Brown and John Williamson were aspiring politicians. The Southern Cross supported the land claimants, such as the New Zealand Company, and vigorously attacked Governor Grey's administration, while the New Zealander supported the ordinary settler and the Maori. The Northern War adversely affected business in Auckland, such that the Southern Cross stopped publishing from April 1845 to July 1847. Hugh Carleton, who also became a politician, was the editor of the New Zealander, then later established the Anglo-Maori War, which followed an editorial policy in opposition to Governor Grey. At the time of the Northern War, the Southern Cross and the New Zealander blamed Henry Williams and the other CMS missionaries for the Flagstaff War. The New Zealander newspaper, in a thinly disguised reference to Henry Williams, with the reference to the Rauteparaha correspondence, went on to state, "We consider these English traitors far more guilty and deserving of severe punishment than the brave natives whom they have advised and misled. Cowards and knaves in the full sense of the terms, they have pursued their traitorous schemes, afraid to risk their own persons, yet artfully sacrificing others for their own aggrandizement, while, probably at the same time, they were most hypocritically professing most zealous loyalty." Official communications also blamed the CMS missionaries for the Flagstaff War. In a letter of 25 June 1846 to William Ewart Gladstone, the colonial secretary in Sir Robert Peel's government, Governor Grey referred to the land acquired by the CMS missionaries and commented that Her Majesty's government may also rest satisfied that these individuals cannot be put in possession of these tracts of land without a large expenditure of British blood and money. By the end of his first term as governor, Grey had changed his opinion as to the role of the CMS missionaries, which was limited to attempts to persuade Hone Heke bring an end to the fighting with the British soldiers and the Ngāpuhi, led by Tamati Wakanene, who remained loyal to the Crown. When he returned to New Zealand in 1861 for his second term as governor, Sir George and Henry Williams meet at the Waimate Mission Station in November 1861. Also in 1861, Henry's son Edward Marsh Williams was appointed by Sir George to be the resident magistrate for the Bay of Islands and Northern Districts. Legacy of Grey's first term as governor. During Grey's first tenure as governor of New Zealand, he was created a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bar. When Grey was knighted, he chose Tamati Wakanene as one of his esquires. Sir George Grey was a profound influence on the final form of the New Zealand Constitution Act 1852. After the 1846 Act was largely suspended at his request, he was briefly appointed Governor-in-Chief, whilst he oversaw the establishment of the first provinces of New Zealand. He took pains to tell Maori that he had observed the terms of the Treaty of Waitangi, assuring them that the land rights would be fully recognized. In the Taranaki district, Maori were very reluctant to sell the land, but elsewhere Grey was much more successful. and nearly 33 million acres were purchased from Maori, with the result that British settlements expanded quickly. Grey was less successful in his efforts to assimilate the Maori. He lacked the financial means to realize his plans. Although he subsidized mission schools, requiring them to teach in English, only a few hundred Maori children attended them at any one time. Grey gave land for the establishment of Auckland Grammar School in Newmarket, Auckland in 1850. The school was officially recognized as an educational establishment in 1868 through the Auckland Grammar School Appropriation Act of the provincial government. Chris Laidlaw concludes that Grey ran a ramshackle administration marked by broken promises and outright betrayal of Maori people. Grey's collection of Maori artifacts, one of the earliest from New Zealand and assembled during his first governorship, was donated to the British Museum in 1854. Second term. Grey was again appointed governor in 1861, to replace Governor Thomas Gore Browne, serving until 1868. His second term as governor was greatly different from the first, as he had to deal with the demands of an elected parliament, which had been established in 1852. Invasion of the Kingitānga. Immediately prior to Grey's reappointment as governor, there were rising tensions in Taranaki that eventually led to the involvement of British military forces at Waitara, in what is sometimes called the First Taranaki War, from March 1860 until the fighting subsided in 1862. The leaders of the King movement at Kingitānga had written a letter to Governor Browne stating that the Waikato tribes had never signed the Treaty of Waitangi and that they were a separate nation. Browne regarded the stance of the Kingitānga as an act of disloyalty, and prepared plans for the invasion of Waikato, in part to uphold the Queen's supremacy in the face of the Kingitānga challenge. Grey launched the invasion of the Waikato in 1863 to take control of the heartland of the Kingitānga. The war brought thousands of British troops to New Zealand. 18,000 men served in the British forces at some point during the campaign, with a peak of about 14,000 troops in March 1864. In the later 1860s, the British government determined to withdraw imperial troops from New Zealand. At the time, the Maori chiefs Te Kuti and Te Tokowaru had the colonial government and settlers extremely alarmed with a series of military successes. With the support of the Premier Edward Stafford, Grey evaded instructions from the Colonial Office to finalize the return of the regiments, which had commenced in 1865 and 1866. In the end, the British government recalled Grey in February 1868. He was replaced by Sir George Bowen and, during his term, hostilities concluded with the abandoned pursuit of war leader Rifa Te Tokowaru, again in Taranaki, in 1869. The legacy of Sir George Grey was greatly respected by Maori, and often travelled with a company of chiefs. He induced leading chiefs to write down their accounts of Maori traditions, legends and customs. His principal informant, Wiremu Maihi Te Rangi Kaheki, taught Grey to speak Maori. Historian Michael King noted, he learned Maori and persuaded Maori authorities to commit the legends and traditions to writing, some of which were subsequently published. His collected papers would turn out to be the largest single repository of Maori language manuscripts. Grey bought Kawau Island in 1862, on his return to New Zealand for a second term as governor. For 25 years he lavished large amounts of his personal wealth on the island's development, including enlarging and remodeling Mansion House, the former residence of the copper mine superintendent. Here he planted a huge array of exotic trees and shrubs, acclimatized many bird and animal species, and amassed a celebrated collection of rare books and manuscripts, artworks and curiosities, plus artifacts from the Maori people over whom he had ruled. In 1865, during Grey's second term as governor, the capital was transferred to Wellington, which was seen as a better choice for an administrative capital because of its proximity to the South Island.